Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Well, actually it's the second episode of the show for the week, but anyway, welcome to this episode. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched the last couple of episodes, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Your support is very much appreciated. This week, I thought it was about time to do another episode of the show on the independent bottling company Duncan Taylor. Why, you may ask? Well, two reasons. Firstly, it's probably been about 2 years since I last did an episode of the show on them, and also that the company kindly sent me some samples not so long ago. So I thought it might be fun to take 3 of those samples and just team them up with 3 older samples, one of which was a sample from a while ago that they kindly sent me, and a couple came from the Independent Bottlers Challenge in 2019. So they're a bit old, but I thought they were worth putting in the lineup. I mean, it's a bit of a shame that the Independent Bottlers Challenge obviously no longer exists, and although some of the single cask releases have now gone into the World Whisky Awards, it's still a big shame that this particular competition has gone, because you know, the independent sector, as you well know, is thriving, and you know, it would be good to get you know, the recognition that the sector really deserves, considering the number of new independents that have been cropping up over the last couple of years. But I guess it's like a lot of things, isn't it? It's kind of money. I don't know how much the Whisky magazine charged for entry into the competition, and it did seem like over the years the number of different independent bottling companies tailed off from when it started, so maybe it wasn't sort of deemed a necessity by those independents, but it's a shame nevertheless. But anyway, and it also means I don't get to taste sort of like a lot of sort of independence bottlings that I ordinarily wouldn't come across. So things like, you know, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, they often entered a number of samples, but anyway, I digress. So anyway, really not a great deal to say about Duncan Taylor themselves that I haven't said already. Obviously link to their website in the box below should you wish to go and check them out if you don't know anything about them. So I'm just going to introduce today's one. Right, okay, we're going to kick off with one of my favourite distilleries. Yes, it's a 9-year-old Glenrothes. Ooh, fun. Right, so this is bottled in their Dimensions range. It's a 9-year-old single bourbon cask 4923204, distilled in December of 2009, and it was bottled in May of 2019 at 54.6%. Then we're going to move on to a more current release. This is the Battlehill 9-year-old Ben Nevis Cognac finish, bottled at 46% and bottled sometime this year. Next bottling is again another recent release, again another Cognac finish, another Battlehill bottling. This is an 11-year-old Glentauchers, again 46% and bottled at some stage this year. Then we're going to move on to the first of the 2 Octave bottlings. As you know, Duncan Taylor are very big on finishing a number of their spirits in sherry octaves. So this is a UK exclusive bottling of Highland Park. It's 15-year-old. It's cask number 5032796. 14 and a half years in ex-American oak with 6 months in the sherry octaves, bottled this year at 54.9%. Next bottling, again an oldie. This is another Dimensions bottling. This is a Peated Benriach. It was 8 years old. It's a single sherry cask 747408. Distilled in April of 2011, bottled in May of 2019, and for a sherry cask, very lightly coloured. So Not expecting a huge amount of sherry character on that, but we shall see. You never know. And the last bottling again is in the Octave range. This is a Caol Ila. It was distilled in 2007, bottled in 2020, so I'm making it 13 years old. Cask number 4023139. Don't know how long it's spent in the sherry Octave, but I think from memory that most of them tend to spend between about 6 and 12 months in the Octaves. So this is bottled at 53.2%, and again, not as much colour as you would expect from the Octave cask. So anyway, I think it's just going to be a bit of an interesting lineup. So, sharp intake of breath. Let's kick off with the Glenrothes then. Right, okay, so 9-year-old Glenrothes bourbon cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Well, it's a bit hard. Which is not a surprise. It is Glenrothes after all. A little spirity, but I will give it. There is some sweet barley. Sweet barley, Glenrothes. Whoa, bloody hell. There's a touch of charred oak. Quite a lot of vanilla. I would guess possibly a first fill cask. There's some almond butter, a little bit of gooseberry, a little bit of green fruit, green apple. Actually, it's not a bad nose at all. I mean, you know, I bang on about sort of, you know, these kind of distilleries that produce this industrial style of spirit, but if you have some balance to it, whether it's, you know, some sort of honeyed notes, some sweeter barley, some oak, that kind of thing, it's pleasant. Well, pleasant as you know, as Glenrothes can be, I suppose. So on the whole, I think the nose is pretty good. And like I said, you are getting the distillery character, but it's not sort of all front and centre, if you see what I mean. So, see what the pass like. A lot of oak, buttery, coffee, toasted wood. Again, gives the impression of first fill bourbon. There is a distillery character there. That hardness kind of comes through on the mid palate and into the finish. Not quite as spirity and as industrial as some I've come across, although, like I said, it has that hardness of character. Medium length, it's okay, it's pleasant. I mean, it's a bit sort of, I wouldn't quite, yeah, I mean, the progression is there, but it's a bit sort of like, you know, oak spirit, there you go. The finish is a little bit masked, so I do get a bit of alcohol on the finish, which is probably sort of what's, you know, hindering its length, shall we say. But we'll stick a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Yeah, softer, it's a little edgy, a little bit more barley, although the barley isn't quite so sweet as what it is without water. Less oak. There's still a little bit of charred oak in the background, some lovely citrus in actual fact, touch of honey. Yeah, it's a lot softer, it's a lot more appealing, it has to be said. Yeah, it's almost got a kind of lime conserve kind of note happening. You know, for Glenrothes, I have to say this is not a bad bottling at all. Let's see what the parts are now. Still quite oaky, but the oak is softer now, more vanilla, less of the toasted character. Again, softer, a little bit of an industrial note just on the end, with a little bit of green fruit as well. Yeah, okay, I have to say that is not a bad bottling of Glenrothes, and well, how often have you heard me say that? So yeah, good start. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Battlehill Ben Nevis. Always nice to try Ben Nevis. You don't seem to see it very often these days, as I keep saying. But so this is quite interesting. So it's 9-year-old cognac finish. Don't know how long it's spent in the cognac cask, but We'll see what the nose gives us. That's a bit on the raw side. I'm getting quite a lot of alcohol, which is quite a surprise for 46%. It's grassy, citric. Wouldn't quite go as far as saying fainty, but it's got that sort of raw spirit character. There's a little bit of maltiness underneath, the sort of more classical Ben Nevis kind of character. I'm not getting a great deal of cognac cask, it has to be said. Maybe there's a bit of dried fruit, but it's just that raw spirit that's just kind of too intense, too much, which is a bit of a shame. I mean, if it was me personally, I think another couple of years in cask would have done this the world of good. Possibly a little bit longer in the finishing cask as well, because like I said, it's not giving a huge amount of cognac-y notes. Let's see what the palate's like. A bit more sort of traditional Ben Nevis-y on the palate, a bit more bready, weightier, fuller, heavier. There's a streak of citrus running through it that's almost astringent, and again there's that youthful spirit note on the mid palate and on the finish. I get a bit of dried apple, a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of charred oak. Yeah, it's okay. It's been bottled too soon in my personal opinion. Like I said, I think another couple of years would have really sort of just taken off that rawness, taken off that edge, maybe given it a little bit more cognac cask, because there's certainly some there. But, you know, if you didn't know that that was finished in a cognac cask, you probably wouldn't have guessed it. So, yeah, not quite so impressed with that one, it has to be said. Okay, so let's move on to the Glentauchers cognac finish. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. This is a little bit older, being 11 years old, so let's see what the nose gives us. Right, well that to me is a more intriguing nose. I'm getting a nice hit of the cognac cask, of dried fruit, dried apple, spice, a little bit of barley coming through. There's that crisp, minerally Glentauchers character. Touch of gooseberry. It's got a lovely vibrancy. That is how that should be, if you see what I mean. More noticeable cognac, so I'm going, oh yeah, okay, I can get that. And maybe it's just because it's had a couple more years, it's just a little bit more mature, there's no sort of rough edges. And Glentauchers, as you know, stands up to all manner of casks because it has that lovely minerally kind of character. And this just works absolutely wonderfully. Lovely, lovely nose, it has to be said. See what the palate's like. That's got a lovely progression. Again, opens up with the cognac cask, with dried apple, the spice. Gives it quite a lovely fullness in actual fact. The minerality and the citrus notes kind of come through on the mid palate, a little bit of barley, and then we kind of return to the cognac-y notes on the aftertaste. Lovely balance, really very, very impressive. Great progression. Lovely aftertaste. Got that lovely sort of sweet barley, slightly sweeter apple with a little bit of green apple and some dried fruit. That is sensational. Now it's about sort of 60 odd quid, 62, 63 quid, which is, I guess, these days par for the course for an independently bottled sort of teen. Well, it's not even a teen, is it? It's 11 for God's sake. And you know, this is where we're at. It's a similar kind of price to the Ben Nevis, and I know which one I would actually prefer to have. So yeah, that's very, very good. Okay, so let's move on to the Highland Park. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? That's a lovely nose. it smells a lot older than 15. It's got that lovely kind of mature, dusty sherry character. Dried fruit, salt, a little bit of vanilla, apricot, melon possibly, pineapple. No rawness, no sort of no edginess. It is very impressive. Lovely sweet peat note coming through now. That's a lovely nose. Like I said, opens up with the sherry, but the sherry is delicate. It's not swamping, and a lot of the time I find with the Octave finishes that they just end up giving it too much sherry character. This is absolutely spot on. The sherry is just sort of emphasising the sort of dried fruit notes and the spice. And like I said, it smells an awful lot older than 15 years old. Now, I think obviously because it's an Octave bottling, there was only about, what, 90 odd bottles, I think. So the Duncan Taylor themselves have no more stock of it. But it is available online. I have seen it for about 140 quid, which... well, it is Highland Park, and Highland Park always has been expensive, even when whiskey was less expensive than it is today. But that's a fantastic nose, it has to be said. See what the pal's like. A little heavier on the cherry, it has to be said. Maybe taste more around about what you would expect for a 15-year-old Highland Park. Not quite so dusty and mature, but it has a lovely sort of sweet heather, sweet peat, subtle dried fruits, vanilla. The American oak comes through nicely on the mid palate as it opens with the sherry and moves into the American oak. Touch of dark toffee, chocolate, salt, spice, again lingering peat. I mean, it's not heavy peat, but it's just there, just in the background, and just continues kind of throughout. It's kind of sort of a bedrock, if you like. Slightly chewy on the finish, no need for water. I'm not going to bother putting any water with it because it's absolutely spot on. The ABV is just kind of emphasising those wood spices just absolutely gorgeously, and I have to say, that's probably one of the best Octave bottlings I've come across, well, that I can remember anyway. That is just absolutely spot on, gorgeous stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Peated Benriach. So, 8 years old. Let's see what nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oof. Pungent, earthy, medicinal peat. Touch of barley possibly, but oof, we're in peat monster land here, it has to be said. I'm not really getting a great deal. There's maybe a little bit of citrus possibly. I'm not getting a great deal of sherry either. Maybe there's a touch of dried fruit. I mean, that was a well used sherry butt, that's all I can say, because it's kind of peat front and centre, young peat, slightly raw peat, medicinal peat. Yeah, I mean, there are going to be people that love this, and you know, it has an appeal, but it's just not a great deal after the peat. That's the problem. So slightly unbalanced. Let's see what the pal's like. More noticeable cherry on the palate, dried fruits, raisins, but again it's pretty much peat centre. Slightly sweeter peat notes, maybe not quite so medicinal, some more burnt heathery kind of peat, a little bit of tar, treacle, like I said, dried fruit, a little bit of spice. It's okay. Again, it's kind of like, you know, not quite as one-dimensional as the nose would suggest. There is a little bit more going on the palate, but again, it's kind of like a bit kind of let's put a little drop of water with it and see if that kind of opens things out. yeah, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference to the nose. It's still very, very peat orientated and not really anything else. There's a, dare I say it, a slight mustiness there now. Only slight, so nothing to get kind of bent out of shape about. But yeah, it's not really opened the nose out to give it an awful lot else apart from the peat. It has to be said. Let's see what passes on. The sherry has kind of almost pretty much disappeared. It's a little bit astringent now. Still very quite, well, still fairly, well, it is very peated. So obviously you peat heads will love this, but for me, just kind of lacks something else. Length is all right, but it's just a bit sort of like, you know. And you could argue that, you know, this is kind of like where peated spays seem to be at. It's too much peat, not enough Speyside character, not enough distillery character, and it's kind of like, yeah, all right, okay, I can see what you're doing. You're trying to be like an Islay. You're trying to sort of like, you know, appeal to the big peat heads. And you've kind of lost sort of like some nuance somewhere down the line. And it's not just Benriach that's done it. It's a lot of these Highland and Speyside distilleries have done exactly the same thing. You know, they've whacked up the peating level, and really they've kind of like got away from the whole, to me, the whole concept of a peated spey being sort of like, you know, spey first and peat second. But you know, like I said, there'll be some of you that absolutely love this kind of whiskey. For me, I'm just not quite so impressed, it has to be said. Like I said, nothing wrong with the actual bottling itself, so nothing against Duncan Taylor with regards to this. It's more a sort of a critique, I suppose, of the distillery rather than anything else. Right, okay, so on to the final whiskey of the afternoon. Well, it's not quite afternoon yet, so it's still morning. Ooh, brew for breakfast. Anyway, let's see what the Caol Ila gives us then, shall we? Dense, sherried. I mean, you look at the colour and you think, well, that's not going to have an awful lot of sherry character, but you stick your nose in the glass and it is sweet peat and sherry, tar, treacle. There's an almost kind of, weirdly enough, sort of confected red fruit note. I mean, I don't know where the hell that comes from. I mean, maybe that's just me, but kind of reminds me a little bit of pomegranates. I mean, you know, this is kind of not what I was expecting at all, and it just goes to show that you should never judge a whiskey on its colour alone. But this is pretty much peat and sherry. I mean, okay, as we well know, peat and sherry are lovely bedfellows, it has to be said, but again, it just lacks some nuance. It's a bit of a kind of like a bit of a sledgehammer, really, isn't it? Anyway, let's see what that's like. Bit alcoholic, a little soapy as well on the finish. Again, it's got this weird red fruit character going on. I mean, I don't know whether it's kind of, I'm fixated in on that now. I've picked it up on the nose, and that's all I can taste. There's some tar, there's some smoke, there's some violets, there's some dried fruit, you know, little raisins. But again, I'm just kind of underwhelmed by it, it has to be said. It's a lovely bog myrtle-y kind of aftertaste. I mean, it's okay, but you know, it's not got the kind of progression, shall we say, that the Highland Park had. It certainly doesn't have the complexity of the Highland Park. Okay, you can argue it's a lot younger, but it's just not quite floating my boat, it has to be said. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see if that indeed kind of opens things out. Let's see what the nose gives us now then. Oh, that's done some weird stuff to it. I mean, it's sweeter. Again, I'm just getting this red fruit. It's almost confected. The peat has kind of dropped off, which often has a tendency to happen with cask strength. Young peated malt, stick some water with it, peat kind of goes, oh, we give up. It's kind of brought out that sort of slightly sort of, confected character, that sort of slight soapiness. It's an odd one, it has to be said. It's kind of, I really don't quite know what to make of it. Let's see what the palate's like now. Herbal, peaty. Yeah, there's more sherry notes now. Again, there's that sort of slight soapiness there, just in the background. Bit more vanilla now. The sort of, although there's the sherry is kind of quite noticeable up front, it does kind of sort of drop off pretty quickly, and you end up in the sort of like the American oak sort of vanillans. It's got this weird red, again, this weird red fruit confected note on the finish. It is just sort of, I can't really kind of get my head around it. It's certainly like no Caol Ila that I've ever tasted, it has to be said. So I suppose in that instance it's sort of like, well, unusual, and if you're into unusual whiskies, see if you can find it. I mean, again, I think there was only about sort of 90 odd bottles of this, so and as it was released sort of like last year, you can probably only, but I don't know where you're going to get it, probably in auction sites, I imagine. But I really don't know what to make of it. I'm honestly and truly on the fence with it. It has some lovely points to it, or some positive points, but it has some negatives as well. And it's a sort of, I think this is one of those kind of whiskies that will very much divide opinion. You'll get some people absolutely love it, you'll get some people hate it, not because it's a peated malt, but because of the sort of like the strange kind of sort of soapy, sort of confected kind of note happening. It's, some of you are probably going to go, well, it's a bit of a bloody mess really, isn't it? Well, it's not really a mess, it's just kind of unusual. It's sort of one of those wonderful quirks, I suppose, that and where would the whiskey industry be without quirks? That's all I can say.
Guys are taking over the city. There's only one force to stop them.
Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, firstly, a big thank you to Duncan Taylor for the samples for the majority of the tasting. Hopefully, it's been an interesting tasting, and I kind of put it together because it was a bit weird and wonderful in places, and sometimes, play devil's advocate, I suppose, because the last thing you want to do is taste everything that's and say, yeah, everything's wonderful, it's all gorgeous, it's all stunning. I mean, yeah, there are. It's always nice to do that. And to be fair, I wouldn't sort of do a tasting with whiskies that were entirely dreadful, but sometimes you have to be a little bit critical. You have to sort of point out some flaws, and I don't really want to say that. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, firstly, a big thank you to Duncan Taylor for the majority of the samples for today's episode of the show. Hopefully they're not disappointed by my review of them, and I kind of picked a couple of them because they were a bit sort of, they're not bad whiskies, but they have a talking point, and at the end of the day, that's what whiskey is all about. You may well agree with me, or you may not agree with me on certain things, and this is the wonderful thing about whiskey. We all have a slightly different perception, we all have a slightly different sort of view of what we're looking for, and like I said, talking points are very, very good. And I will say that none of these whiskies were dreadful, and I do try and avoid doing an episode of the show where I put in dreadful whiskies, because what's the point? As somebody once said to me, well, if you can't say anything nice about a whiskey, well, don't say anything at all. And that's very, very valid, it has to be said. Anyway, the Glenrothes, do you know what? I was actually quite impressed by that, how many times you're going to hear me say that about a bottling of Glenrothes? That was actually not too bad a bottling. Yeah, if you want to sort of search it out, I did look on Whiskey Base, and it is available on the continent. I think €70, I think. So what's that, about sort of 50, 60 quid. So yeah, I mean, not a bad bottling of Glenrothes at all. The Ben Nevis, I think, was just bottled too soon. I think that really should have done with another couple of years in the cask. There was too much rawness there, not enough cognac cask notes. And like I said, you know, if you didn't know it was cognac finished, you would have never have guessed that. Glenrothes, on the other hand, was absolutely gorgeous, spot on, right amount of age, right amount or a good amount of cognac cask character. Maybe it's because because Glentauchers has that kind of character that just stands up to sort of like, you know, a multitude of different casks. It worked, but it did work. It was absolutely gorgeous. Star of the show has to be the Highland Park. I mean, like I said, you know, I'm not the world's biggest fan of the Octave range. I often do tend to find that they are a little overly heavy on the sherry, but you know, that was stunningly good. And like I said, if you can find it, then get yourself a bottle. The Benriach, I just thought was kind of a little one-dimensional. It was, and like I said, it's not the fault of the bottling company. It's not Duncan Taylor's fault. They purchased a cask of peated Benriach. It's just too peated. It's the distillery's problem, really, at the end of the day, and it's not just them. It's an awful lot of distilleries that just basically don't ordinarily use peat. Well, I mean, although Benriach, as we well know, has been using peat for donkey's years, it's just too peaty and, you know, not enough sort of space on character. And the Caol Ila, like I said, not a bad whiskey, just a weird whiskey at the end of the day. It had some strange things going on in there, it has to be said. Well, you know, like I said, if you can pick up a bottle and you'll find out what I mean. But overall, like I said, has to be impressed with what Duncan Taylor are doing, and yeah, some good stuff. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have no idea what will be happening next week, but it will hopefully be interesting. So until then, good afternoon and good ramming.
Captain Cable lacks the enemy's machines. Officer shoots his stapler gun. The admiral's 8th Army attacks. Our combined forces will stop them. We are the Knights of Justice.
Double kill. Monster kill. You have won the match.